very much. It is an enormous pleasure to be here this evening. This is the second time I have travelled out of the British Isles since March 2020, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to be here. And I look forward to talking to you tonight about the artistic relationship of two artists who had a very close family relationship. They were brothers-in-law, but they were exceedingly different in the way in which they worked. But together, they're among two of the greatest artists of Renaissance Italy, and that's Andrea Mantegna and Giovanni Bellini. And if I can get this to work, I am showing you them both on the screen. At the far end, away from me, you see Mantegna as he painted himself in a painting of the Presentation of the Temple, which is really a representation of him and his family in Berlin. And close to me, you see Giovanni Bellini in his version of the same composition, which is now in the Querini Stampalia Museum in Venice. And this is really the enigma of Mantegna and Bellini. They knew each other for over half a century as a result of Mantegna's marriage to Bellini's half-sister Nicolosia, and yet few artists of their time could have been more different. Mantegna's art, if I can characterize it, it really dazzles for its audacity, for its boldness, its spatial innovation, and his narrative novelty. Mantegna tells a story in a cinematic sense, 500 years before the invention of the moving picture. And Bellini's pictures are very different. They're very, very renowned for their calmness, for their timeless beauty, and for the variety of landscape, of details of the natural world, and indeed of human emotion they show, but using a much more conventional range of subject matter and indeed of function. Both painters were very well known among their own day, within a community of artists, not just in Italy, but further beyond. We remember that Dürer, of course, on his visit to Venice, says that Giovanni Bellini may be very old, but he's still the best. But although Mantegna's inventions have always been known since his lifetime, because he was one of the first artists to really have his work made into prints, and therefore they were known in all sorts of form and transmitted, Bellini's activity was really overshadowed, I might say, by two more bombastic artists who came later. That's Giorgione and Titian. Of course, the second is very well represented in Spanish collections. So Bellini was an artist who was underestimated for about 300 years. But at times, these great painters had a very close artistic dialogue. At other moments, they had very separate trajectories. But even at the points where they were in close contact, making versions of the same composition, as you see in my details on the screen, I think their fundamental attitude to picture making was very, very different. And that's really what I want to tease out this evening. And families, of course, were among one of the closest relationships in pre-modern Europe, as indeed they are today. But in an artist workshop, it was even different. Most artists worked with their parents, with their siblings, their in-laws and their spouses, partly because it was easy, and partly, of course, because you didn't have to pay them. What was distinctive in the case of Mantegna and Bellini, that despite this close family connection, the two artists developed in completely distinct ways, and familiarity, rather than breeding contempt, as we often say in English, created two very different artistic personalities, which benefited, in fact, from a process of sharing and exchange and of difference spread over more than 50 years. And my talk tonight is really based on observations that I gleaned from curating the exhibition, which was mentioned in the introduction, the Bellini and Mantegna exhibition, which I curated with my colleagues Dagmar Korbacher, Neville Rowley, and Sarah Viles at the National Gallery in London and the Staatliche Museum zu Berlin in 2018-2019. And tonight I want to look at several case studies to examine Mantegna and Bellini's relationship afresh. And it's going to build on the research we did for and during and after the exhibition, also in collaboration with our colleagues in the conservation departments in London and Berlin, Jill Dunkerton and Babette Hartwig. And I'm also going to take an opportunity to focus on the beautiful but extraordinary small painting by Mantegna in the Prado, the Dormition of the Virgin, which, if you haven't looked at before, I hope after tonight's talk you will be rushing up to see tomorrow morning. So, who were Mantegna and Bellini? The question of their relationship, and I'm showing you here an image which may be Giovanni Bellini's self-portrait, however, I think it's that, but some art historians think it's his brother Gentile, and you'll understand in a minute why we still really know so little information about Bellini's life. Now, this was a question, the relationship of Mantegna and Bellini, which became really of interest to art historians in the early 20th century. And the primer mover in this case was the father of Italian art history, a brilliant writer called Roberto Longhi, who died in about 1970. Now, Longhi was absolutely determined to demonstrate that Mantegna was younger than Bellini, because he saw Bellini as being absolutely key to the Venetian Renaissance and its prime innovator. Now, understanding this question is complicated by a very major discrepancy. We know a great deal about Mantegna. He was an intensely litigious man. Law records are often the best way for finding out about Renaissance artists, and Mantegna is no exception to this case. But we know practically nothing concrete about the biographical details of Giovanni Bellini's life. So in 2022, we are still not certain of his date of birth, the name of his mother, or indeed very much about his private life at all. It's often been said this may have been because he was illegitimate. This, of course, was a considerable social stigma in Renaissance Europe. However, it seems unlikely because he was always acknowledged as a son by his father Jacopo, and I think it may simply be, and I think this is corroborated by the evidence of Bellini's paintings, that he was an intensely private man. But whoever his mother was, whenever he was born, and I'm going to stake my cards on the table and say I think it was around the year 1435, Bellini did grow up among one of the most successful artistic dynasties in the greatest trading centre in Western Europe in the 1430s, 40s, and early 50s, and that's the city of Venice. Now, all of his artistic training, as was completely usual for artists born into artistic family, was within the family workshop. It was with his father, Jacopo, and his slightly older brother, Gentile. Again, we don't know very much about Jacopo Bellini's paintings because very few of them survive, but his talent is very clearly manifested in his great drawing books, which survive in Paris and London, and which are two of the greatest treasures of Renaissance art. I'm going to show you an image from one of them later. They're very difficult to reproduce, but they're absolutely extraordinary. But we know from these what an exceptionally talented artist Jacopo was. And we also know that he was a very highly respected painter, not just in Venice, but throughout northern Italy, working primarily in the northern Italian courts. I know you've had a lecture on Italian history, so you have some sense of the complicated geography and political landscape of Italy at this date. And Jacopo was really valued in these arenas for his mastery of illusionistic perspective, his skill as a portraitist, also his interest in classical antiquity, which of course was everywhere around you in 15th century Italy, as it is today, and in his curiosity in the world of his contemporaries, the world around him. His elder son Gentile, who died in 1507, left Jacopo's two precious drawings albums, evidently the most precious possessions of the siblings as well as of their father, to his dear brother Giovanni, asking that in exchange Giovanni would finish a very, very large painting today in the Brera of the preaching of St. Mark in Alexandria. This was made by the two brothers for the Scuola di San Grande di San Marco, an organization, one of the charitable confraternities in Venice, in which they were both very, very much involved. But really, what this is to say is that Gentile, Giovanni Bellini, their brother Niccolo, and their sister Nicolosia, who was the eldest of Jacopo's children, had many advantages in life. And that was apart from being born into a great artistic family. Jacopo belonged to an important rank in Venice. He was a cittadino, or a citizen. Now, what this meant was that the family had a very established place in the social hierarchy. They were citizens, which put them just below the patricians, those people whose names were written in the Golden Book, and this meant that they had a clear place in the social hierarchy. The picture I'm showing you on the screen is a fantastical view of Alexandria in northern Africa, in Egypt. But Gentile, who painted this partly with his brother Giovanni, knew parts of the Eastern Mediterranean intimately. He was sent actually as a diplomat on a famous journey to Constantinople to paint the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, in the late 1470s. And Gentile, like his brother Giovanni, didn't just paint for the scuole. He was the official painter to the Venetian state, spending much of his life working for the Doge's palace, producing extraordinary paintings, sadly, which were totally destroyed by fire in 1577. So although we don't know much about Gentile's work, we do know a lot of Giovanni, because he's been consistently admired by artists. Albrecht Dürer, as I said in 1506, that although he was very old, he was still the best in painting. And since the 19th century, the enthusiastic advocacy of the very influential British critic John Ruskin means that Giovanni's been considered one of the best of early Venetian artists. So Longhi, who I mentioned beginning of this talk about Bellini, went so far to argue that his altarpieces were fundamental for the development, not just of Venetian art, but for all Venetian painting. So that's Giovanni Bellini, in a nutshell, an artist from an established family with every advantages, living in what was, at that point, the greatest trading centre, the greatest commercial centre of Western Europe. And what about Mantegna? I'm showing you Mantegna as he creeps out in an extraordinary self-portrait on the edges of his wonderful fresco commission, the Camera degli Sposi in Mantua. Mantegna entered the world with no real advantages at all. He was born in and around 1431 in a very small village outside Padua in northeastern Italy. His father was not a famous painter, he was a carpenter. And Mantegna seems to have grown up not initially knowing how to read or write. Padua, in contrast to Mantegna's upbringing in the small village of Isola di Cartura, was a very, very famous university. And although students flocked to study there, Mantegna's own upbringing was impoverished and seemingly lacking in any intellectual stimulation. He was an entirely self-made man. That is extraordinary today, but that is even more extraordinary in 15th century Europe, when people's family, their status, their class, if it were, had an awful lot to do with how their lives would pan out. But Mantegna, aged 11, had what was a bit of chance, although it was quite difficult. He became apprenticed to a very well-known man within Padua, the artist Francesco Squarcione. Squarcione was an artist who, this is the only painting by him that actually survives today. It's in the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. His principal talents were not to paint, but in identifying very talented young men who could work for him. And that was the case in Mantegna. Squarcione had what was called an academy in the city of Padua. He had casts and copies of Greek and Roman antiquities. These were reasonably little known in early 15th century Italy. And what Squarcione's training was able to do was to open Mantegna's eyes, literally, to the world around him, to begin to explore the Roman and indeed the Greek inheritance, which was just scattered around the earth of Padua and other cities in northern Italy, and of course, greatest of all, in the Roman capital, Rome. His time with Squarcione was not very happy. It was brutally exploitative, and it was made worse when Mantegna, like many other teenage artists, well, I can think of at least 2 or 3, became one of Squarcione's adopted sons. Now, if Mantegna went into this relationship thinking that he would have the sorts of advantages offered to the Bellini brothers by being part of an artistic family, he was soon and very, very sorely disappointed. Squarcione just wanted him to work for him. He didn't really want anything else. And it's a measure of Mantegna's self-belief and talents that at the age of 17, he took a law case against his adoptive father and won, freeing himself quickly from his control, age 17, in 1448. In the same year, Mantegna signed his earliest surviving work. This is an altarpiece for the Church of Santa Sofia in Padua. It's now destroyed, sadly, but it first brought him to the attention of that very prosperous and intellectual city's literary and artistic elite. Mantegna was a really quick developer. He was incredibly precocious. He'd had to learn quickly because it was his way of getting on in the world. And I think it's not surprising that his talents very quickly came to the attention of Jacopo Bellini in not too distant Venice. Now, today it's possible to get a train from Venice to Padua and be there, if you're really lucky, in about 20 minutes. But in the 15th century, it wasn't too bad. You got on a boat and you could do it within the course of an evening. So Bellini was always very aware of what was going on in Padua, which was really the intellectual capital of the Venetian Republic. And Jacopo's friend, the intellectual Ulisse degli Aliotti, who was also someone connected with Mantegna, probably introduced them. And there's a lot to relate Mantegna to Jacopo Bellini in his early work. Firstly, his use of colour, but most of all in the impact of the field of narrative painting, where Jacopo has made his name and where Mantegna was soon to do so as well. I'm showing you here one of the saddest slides in my presentation. Mantegna made this extraordinary fresco chapel in Padua when he was a very young man in the church of the Eremitani. It's the chapel of the Auditorio family. Some of you may have visited it and seen its fragments. It was largely destroyed by Allied bombing in 1944, but we know from the fragments of there and the photographs, and indeed Mantegna's preparatory drawings which survive, how exceptional it was. He tried out all these things which he had seen in the paintings of people like Jacopo Bellini, and also he was developing himself, foreshortening, illusionism, putting figures into cityscapes which seemed both ancient and modern at the same time. It was an absolutely sensational work of art. And Jacopo Bellini, on seeing this, must have noticed that this was an artist who could do very, very well working with him in the Bellini family workshop. It was also probably clear to him at this date that this sort of area, illusionistic narrative painting, was not going to be where both of his sons were to develop their careers. Gentile's particular talent was already becoming evident in portraiture and recording the collective life of the Venetian Republic, while Giovanni's ability to use light and colour to tell stories, as we'll see as this lecture goes on, creating pictures really of enduring beauty, would shape the course of painting in Renaissance Venice. And the pragmatic solution was, therefore, to marry Niccolò Bellini to Mantegna. And Mantegna's presentation on the temple, which I'm showing you on the screen, is a picture which was made by Mantegna in the mid-1450s, probably very shortly after he'd married Niccolò Bellini. And the presentation in the temple is the moment when Mary brings the infant Christ into the temple in Jerusalem and gives him to be held by the high priest Simeon. It's the moment when Christ really becomes, I suppose, a person with an identity for the first time. And what's extraordinary about Mantegna's painting is that he puts himself, he's the character close to me, just peeking out behind Simeon at the edge of the picture, and his wife into the work. Now, Niccolò may be the Virgin, or she may be the woman at the far end of the picture, at the far left, opposite Mantegna, but they're definitely here, and this is a painting, really, of their marriage. Now, the solution from Jacopo Bellini's point of view was a very good one. With this marriage, Mantegna's exceptional talents would be safe within the Bellini family fold, rather than being a potential threat. And marrying a daughter to a talented young man was very, very common practice among the artists and artisans of Renaissance Europe. And indeed, it was one adopted too by the Bellini family's greatest rivals, the Vivarini, who married an important German artist who came to work to them into their family. For Mantegna, this proposition was also an attractive offer. It gave him much more access to the art market for Venice, and he must have seen it in this way very pragmatically, because marriages at this time were not about love, they were generally about business. It would also have given him access to the courts of northeastern Italy, where Jacopo had often worked, offering many more opportunities for patronage, in short, than intellectual Padua or nearby Verona. And possibly, if he were to become a Venetian citizen, he would also be able to get work from the Venetian state. So we have quite a clear sense about what Mantegna might have thought about this. We have no idea what Nicolosia Bellini's point of view was. And that, of course, is very common at this date when women are completely hidden from the historical record. She had no opportunity to state her views, at least not in any form that could be recorded. But we can guess that the marriage was probably reasonably successful. At least it provided male children, which was the goal of marriage generally at this point, and Mantegna didn't remarry when he became widowed. But in terms of its artistic goals, it did not achieve its purpose, because in 1460, just a few years after the wedding, Mantegna moved with his family from Padua to Mantua to accept the position of court painter to the Marquis of Mantua, and he spent the rest of his career there in that very, very beautiful but quite small and isolated city, working for successive generations of the Gonzaga family on whatever subject or whim took them. What was good about this was that Mantegna was freed from any form of competition. He was able to develop on his own terms his talent and his passion for animating, in, as I've said, a proto-cinematic sense, the erudite worlds of Greek and Rome and early Christian history, and make them believable to people who looked at them. I think perhaps the most extraordinary of Mantegna's achievements in this form is the painted room in the castle of Mantua. If you haven't had a chance to visit it, do, now that it's possible to travel. Here you're taken in this tiny space into all the dreams, thoughts, reality and history of the Gonzaga family, their connections across Europe and also to the world beyond through the brilliance of their illusionistic painter. His other great success in Mantua was the cycle of pictures which really made his posthumous name. These are the 12 triumphs of Caesar, painted very towards the end of his career in the 1480s. They are famous throughout Europe because in the 17th century, they were bought by Charles I of England. They were also much copied in Mantegna's day and in prints. And I think every artist who was interested in telling Roman history from the 15th to the 18th century, and because this was the heart of the academic canon, this was frankly most of them, knew or were impacted on by Mantegna's triumphs. They are really an extraordinary, successful work of the fruit of his long interest and studies, erudite studies into Roman history, but also of the way in which he was able to tell pictorial stories through action. Mantegna really manages to bring the very dry lines, and they're sometimes exceedingly dry, of humanist history to exuberant life, as these works show. He was not, however, a rival to the Bellinis, even though they weren't working together, because his talent and work was developing, despite the marriage, along very, very separate and different lines. But both Andrea Mantegna and Giovanni Bellini on occasions did change how they worked in really interesting ways, and this seems to have been in response to each other. This is much more obvious in the case of Bellini, who was only able to find a distinct artistic voice, one that was different from his father and his brother, from actually, in the first instance, as we'll see, from copying Mantegna. And in the 1450s, which was the formative decade of Giovanni Bellini's career, when he was probably quite a lot in Padua with his brother, his father, and also his brother-in-law Mantegna, there was considerable contact and connection between them. And although there's very little documentary evidence from that, we can see it in their art. In the early 1450s, Giovanni and Gentile Bellini were very, very much in Padua. They were working on a very large commission for the former military commander of the city, who goes beyond the extraordinary name of the honeyed cat, gatta melata in Italian. And they were painting an altarpiece for his memorial chapel in Padua's most important church, the Santo. Now, sadly, the altarpiece has all gone except for the predella panels, those narrative stories along the bottom register of the painting. And I'm showing you one of these here, the crucifixion, which is today in the Museo in Venice. What's really interesting about these predella panels is that you can see the separate artistic personalities of Jacopo and his two sons in them. The crucifixion here, the figure of on cross, and also the man, the soldier who's kneeling at the foot of this. These do seem quite possibly to be the earliest work of Giovanni Bellini, but within a small painting that was also authored by his father. Now, the first signs of of Giovanni developing as an independent artistic personality are in works that were made very much under the influence of Mantegna. And Mantegna was also very much impacted by his new close connection with the Bellini family, because the most important part of his marriage, artistically and probably brutally the most important part of his marriage per se, was his access to Jacopo Bellini's extraordinary drawing books. Now, I'm showing you a page from one of the two books. I have to apologize for this image. It's incredibly difficult to see. And that's because Jacopo Bellini worked on these with chalk, which has become faded, really, really badly faded over the years. To look at them properly, you've got to go on the British Museum website or the website of the Musée du Louvre in Paris. And then you will see, as you scroll through these pages on this screen, these extraordinary artistic fantasies and ideas that Jacopo put in his books. He copied Roman antiquities that he knew. He came up with ideas for common subjects, such as the agony of the garden, which if your eyes are exceedingly good, you might be able to work out some of the lineaments of here, and also stories from classical history as well. They're incredible works of art. And in these books, you really get the sense of a unique artistic personality, and that's what Mantegna wanted access to. Now, this image, difficult though it is for you to see it, shows the agony in the garden, or more specifically, it shows a rock in the center on which the figure of Christ is praying. That's supposedly the Mount of Olives, where Christ went near the Garden of Gethsemane to pray and to wait before Judas came with the Roman soldiers who were to betray him. And what I want to talk about now is Mantegna and Bellini's two depictions of this subject, both derived from Jacopo, but very different in their own ways. And these pictures normally hang side by side on the National Gallery's walls in London, as they have done since 1893. And they were one of the main reasons for developing the Mantegna and Bellini exhibition project that we did in London and Berlin 3 and 4 years ago. So I'm showing you here Mantegna's Agony. This is the first of the two works, painted in Padua in the 1450s. It's a highly personal painting, and it seems to reflect Mantegna's interests as much as those of his patron, who we don't know who it was, but it must have been someone very, very intellectual and probably a humanist theologian who was interested in Greek and Roman antiquity, but also in really understanding the history and the archaeology of the Bible. The picture is very, very rich in complexity and in details, but in its scale, it's really surprisingly small. It's about 63 by 80 centimeters. And what you can see that Mantegna does in this painting is he takes you in on the road at the front and takes you on a journey, as it were, from the sleeping apostles in the foreground to the figure of God, of Christ, who's praying on the rock, with the angels in front of him who are bearing the instruments of his passion, showing that he's soon about to be put to death. And interestingly, Mantegna's created this extraordinarily illusionistic prayer desk. It's both a rock and architecture at the same time. It's really wonderful. This is a characteristic he develops, and it's truly a spectacular thing about his work. But what's interesting about the placement is that Christ is here really literally halfway to heaven. He's separated from the disciples. He's above the city of Jerusalem, behind him, but he's not quite yet in heaven. And if you look carefully, you can see a procession that's making its way from the city in the background to the figure of Christ. And that's Judas, the treacherous Judas, and the Roman soldiers who are about to take Christ away to his doom. Behind them is the city of Jerusalem. And this is at once the heavenly city, as described in the book of Revelations by St. John the Divine, and a real one. The ideal, I think, is implicit in the combination, and you may be able to see if your eyes are very good, of Christian, of Muslim, and of ancient Roman motifs in the architecture of the city. You can see, for instance, Church Campanile, you can see the Islamic crescent, and you can also see structures that resemble the Colosseum and Trajan's column. But the actual is also implied in this painting. If you look at the wall of the city, you'll be able to see that the brickwork has been repaired, and a really interesting detail. Perhaps this is an allusion to the consistent destruction of Jerusalem, both before and after the birth of Christ. And this is one of the very earliest examples of Mantegna's very characteristic passion for creating archaeologically accurate images of the ancient world. Now, while he was, and here's a detail showing you this, I particularly love the wall and the way it's been mended with this mortar, so that you can see there are different colors of the brick in its back. So while Mantegna was working on this, he also undertook a really substantial, large commission, and that was for the Benedictine monastery of San Zeno in Verona. This was at the instigation of the foundation's abbot, a very learned Venetian nobleman called Gregorio Correr. This is the St. Zeno altarpiece, which is still in situ, marvelous to see still in the church it was made for. The Pradello panels, I'm afraid, were taken away by Napoleon, and the one I particularly want you to look at is the Agony in the Garden, again, which is in the Museo des Beaux-Arts in Tours. It's unfortunately not able ever to be lent because of the conditions of its gift, so you have to go to Tours to look at it. But there seems to be, interestingly, much greater expressive connection in this painting between the landscape and the figures than you often see in Mantegna's work. And if you look carefully, you can see that the clouds have been organized to draw attention to the vanishing point from which the sun is beginning to rise at the back of the landscape. And this use of land and skyscape to try and provoke a very personal and emotional response from the viewer is one of the salient features of Giovanni Bellini's work. And this seems to have been the first time that Mantegna takes something from his much younger brother-in-law and does something else with it. But just to make things even more complicated, at the same time that Mantegna is working on these two agonies, Bellini is doing his own version, which seems at the first instance to be almost a copy of Mantegna's. In some ways, it's quite a clumsy painting, certainly in comparison to Mantegna's virtuosity. You can see it's also much bigger. Bellini has taken the figures of Mantegna's composition and put them in a much more expansive landscape. He was also a much more clumsy artist at this date, and perhaps you can see this in the comparison of the underdrawing. On the left-hand side, you see Mantegna's underdrawing of the figure of Christ. If you look, you can see that he makes changes as he's going on. In contrast, Bellini's underdrawing is very schematic. He knew what he was doing and he did it. There are no changes at all. And my colleague Jill Dunkerton thinks this is really an example of how Mantegna was able to really invent and to improvise at this point. Bellini was still learning and he hadn't quite got to that stage. But they've worked in very similar methods. They both made their underdrawing in brush and a liquid brush black media, and they did this directly onto prepared gesso panels. Another comparison, if I can go back to it, I think also shows a sort of subtle difference. And this is about the foreshortening. Mantegna was an absolute master of foreshortening. If any of you have tried to draw or paint, you will know how difficult it is to achieve. Mantegna makes it look as if it was incredibly easy. But when you look at Bellini's painting on the right, you can see that it's a much more complicated thing to do. Bellini has tried to do a foreshortened figure, sleeping figure, at the bottom of his painting, like Mantegna. But although it seems to be convincing, it hasn't worked quite as well. And one thing I would like to point out, and when you come to London and see the two paintings together, get very close and look at the teeth. Mantegna has painted every tooth in the saint's upper mouth and every hair in his moustache and his beard, whereas Bellini does this in a much more schematic way. And here is another really extraordinary detail. When we were doing the technical study for the exhibition, we looked closely at all the paintings and works on paper that were going to be into it. And when we looked at the two agonies in London, we realized that there are rocks at the bottom, but they're done in very different ways. Mantegna seems to have taken a paintbrush, and rather like you would have a toothbrush and put water on it, he flicked paint with his brush just straight onto the painted surface, and that was a rock. He just did that immediately. It's incredible. Bellini, however, had to paint them individually, and so he never used this technique again. He tried it, but he couldn't quite work it out. And I'm showing you now the two paintings side by side, so you really get a sense of the discrepancy and the difference of the scale. Mantegna's painting is on the right, and on the left, and Bellini's is on the right. And on the wall, it's immediately apparent that Bellini's work is about a third larger than Mantegna's. And he's taken the miniature scale of Mantegna's agony and enlarged it onto a far larger landscape. And while Mantegna focuses on incredible details, such as the lime wash I pointed out on the city wall, or the rabbits who are frolicking on the hillock where Christ is praying, or indeed the lovely egrets beautifully observed in the bottom right-hand corner, Bellini's painting is about landscape. It's expansive, and the figures are widely separated and spread out. I think the forms of the earth in this painting are also meandering. The art historian Paul Hills has observed how the rolling swirls of the hills at the far right seem really to recall the shapes, textures, and palette of a vessel made out of a hard stone, like chalcedon. There's something already very different to Mantegna that Bellini is trying to create in his paintings. Everything also in Bellini's painting, I think, shows quite organic. Even the man-made objects, from the picket fence in the right-hand corner to the bridge that grows from the living rock to cross the torrent in the middle distance, they seem as if they've always been there. But the most important change that Bellini made in comparison to Mantegna was to make his figures really integral to the landscape. They mirror and they complement its forms. So for instance, you can see that the sleeping disciples are echoing the hill that's crowned with buildings behind them. And the profile of Christ's head, his beard, and his praying hands lead us directly to the outline of a hill which is topped by a church tower, lit by the sunrise, which is reflecting through the clouds. So I think what Bellini's doing here is giving a message. Although this is Christ's agony, everything is going to be all right. Ultimately, he's going to be resurrected. And so, of course, are we looking and contemplating this work of art too. I find it really incredible how he paints the light of dawn in his work. In this painting, it shines directly onto the figure of Christ. It really sort of throws the light red clothing on his back into relief, picking out the gold highlights on the folds of the drapery at the top of his lower body. That's another technique, using powdered gold as if it were paint, that Bellini has taken directly from Mantegna. As I've said, there's this church tower that your eye is drawn to from the figure of Christ, and this takes you further up into the sky to a ghostly angel carrying the chalice of salvation placed directly in the sky above. So unlike Mantegna, Bellini has not tried to depict the Holy Land in a way that was meant to be convincing. He's done something that might even be more radical, and which was in tune with the most innovative theological trends of his day, the so-called devotio moderna, which emphasized placing yourself into a scene from Christ's own life. So he's placed the agony of Christ, and by implication his salvation, in the world that he and his contemporaries inhabited. Now, Bellini didn't just come up with this himself. He did manage to use landscape so that it became not just an element of painting, but the feature that conveyed the principal meaning of its works. And part of this he learnt from the Netherlandish paintings he was able to see in Venice. This is Dirk Bouts' Entombment, now in the National Gallery in London, but which we're pretty certain was made for a Venetian patron. And here you can see that Christ's body has been put within the wider context of the Northern European countryside. There's a rocky outcrop, and this contrast with rolling hills and deciduous trees and farmland. So Bellini's career, during his lifetime, there really was an appreciation of the special nature of his landscapes. It led to the development, I think, of the first true landscape painting, in which Bellini was able to indulge his desire, as his friend the humanist Pietro Bembo put it, to wander at will within painting, creating far vistas and fantasies which take you far away from the painted surface you're looking at. And these delighted his contemporaries, even if the subjects, such such as the work I'm showing you the screen here, St. Jerome praying, were very, very conventional. And these were Bellini's response to the Venetian market where he worked, where paesi or landscapes were valued by discerning collectors. And I think such paintings had an impact over many years on Mantegna. We've seen how he adapted the skyscape in his San Zeno, Agony in the Garden, to Giovanni Bellini's work. And throughout his career, on certain occasions, dependent on patronage, he makes a number of paintings which are very, very Bellinian. And just as Mantegna was recognized by Bellini as a brilliant creator of intellectual landscapes, it's clear from the visual evidence that Mantegna admired and sometimes emulated his brother-in-law's singular and signature combination of light and landscape to give meaning. Here is a small painting painted by Mantegna in the 1490s for his patroness Isabella d'Este, the very, very demanding young wife of the new Marquis of Mantua. Now, it shows holy figures set in the sort of constructed landscape that Isabella at this date was hoping to receive from Bellini, but which, because he didn't have to paint, he wasn't a court painter, he never produced. But the question of landscape is really pertinent to one of the most beautiful Italian paintings in Spain, and that's the tiny Dormition of the Virgin up in the galleries upstairs. The painting came to the Prado in 1829, and it was probably, although not conclusively, painted for the chapel in the castle of Mantua, which already in 1459, the date of this work, was being made to Mantegna's specifications. Now, the subject is the moment when the Virgin's soul departs her body. She's lying on a bier in the company of the 11 remaining apostles, and you can see in their various expressions and movements the way in which they are articulating their grief. The setting is in a vaulted interior. The Prado painting, as you probably know, has been cut down. There's a tiny fragment representing the soul of the Virgin already risen into heaven in the Pinacoteca Nazionale in Ferrara. But what's really interesting here is that the modulation of the space is very much indebted to Jacopo Bellini with this use of the window frame to frame the picture. But the most remarkable feature of all, I think, is the landscape. The arch that opens up behind the Virgin and her companions is looking onto a lake. And this is no idealized location, but it's the lagoon of Mantua itself, as it would be seen from the castle, and where you can still see it if you visit today. And we're meant to be imagining that Mary's Dormition is happening not in Jerusalem, but it takes place in the very castle itself. And Mantegna's view of the bridge over the water and the boats powered by oars, which are slowly making their way across the limpid water, is exceptionally beautiful, as are the reflections of the bridge itself. And the elegiac feel of the landscape and the soft quality of the light really does make you think of Giovanni Bellini. But the desire to show an actual landscape would have been antithetical to Bellini. He would never have been quite so literal, though Mantegna was much happier with using actual places and spaces and always interested in creating a distinct sense of place, from the Ovitari Chapel in Padua to the extraordinarily bizarre meeting of the Gonzaga family in the Camera degli Sposi. This was a meeting between the Gonzaga Duke and his two sons. It was meant to have taken place in 1462 at a very dull settlement called Bozzolo on the plains of Lombardy. So Mantegna decides it's much more interesting and symbolic to put it in front of an idealized view of Rome. Very convincing, although it's totally inaccurate. It was done to draw attention to the Gonzaga family's connections to the papacy. But in the Dormition, we see a painting exactly that is really a painting by Mantegna, but is much more in the mode of Giovanni Bellini. And another very Bellinian work by Mantegna is one which comes much later. It's this picture on the screen of the suffering Redeemer, Christ as the suffering Redeemer, now in Copenhagen. There are many good reasons to visit Copenhagen: the food, the architecture, the beauty, but one of them is to see this picture, which is possibly one of the best preserved Italian Renaissance paintings of the Quattrocento, anyone in the world. It was probably made in Mantua for a Mantuan patron, perhaps from the Valenti family, from whose descendants it's passed to the Danish king in 1763. It was painted in the mid-1490s and on tempera. And interestingly, although Bellini soon adopted oil paint as something which gave him much more possibilities in terms of glaze, of saturation, of subtle differences, Mantegna was very happy to use the ostensibly much less flexible tempera which bound pigments in egg yolk until the rest of his life. But he's able, because he's such a master, to make this seem the most natural thing of all. Now, this painting shows Christ with his wounds from his crucifixion. You can see the two on his hands, the two on his feet, and the one on his proper right side when the spear was stuck into him. He's placed on a marvelous porphyry tomb. Porphyry was a hard stone that was reserved for the graves of kings and of emperors, and it functions here as a throne as well as a tomb, highly appropriate for Christ, the King of Kings. There's a very sort of balletic gesture between the two angels who are supporting Christ through his fabric and his heavy body. They really show that he is dead. But what is also amazing about Mantegna's painting is that we are seeing Christ at the moment just before his resurrection, when his body is turning from death to light. His feet are white as marble. They're very similar in color to the shift that colors his legs. But his arms, if you look carefully, are beginning to pulse with life. You can see the veins standing out strongly on his chest, and his face is turning a rather ruddy and healthy pinkish color, although his upturned eyes still denote his suffering. Behind in the natural world, we see that dawn is rising, and this is mirroring the changes that are happening in Christ's body. The sky beyond him is multicolored. It's suffused with the most glorious light, with yellows and pinks which are reflected in the clouds. And we can see the crosses behind on the hill on which Christ and his companions were died. But also, we can see life returning in the world, in the actions of the people who are populating this landscape. I'm showing you a screen of detail of the masons who are already busy at work in the quarry behind the body of Christ. One is just finishing a sculpture. I think this is meant to be Mantegna giving another sort of little allusion to the life that is just becoming in the body of Christ at the center of his painting. And also, on the other side of the picture, you can see farmhands and shepherds yawning and stretching as they rise from their earthly bed to start the day. And also the figures of the two Marys who are scurrying through the cold landscape to get towards the tomb and the dead body that they are expecting to find. So Mantegna's painting is a graphic, colorful, light-filled representation of the resurrection. It's also one of the very strongest echoes of Bellini's impact of his brother-in-law, many, many years after they'd been in regular or direct artistic contact. And throughout their lives, there would have been very constant comings and goings between the Mantegna family in Mantua and their Bellini relatives in Venice. As Western Europe's most important commercial centre, Mantegna, like most of his contemporaries, got his paints shipped from Venice. And Mantegna's patrons, the Gonzaga Marquises of Mantua, were within the Venetian sphere of influence, and Francesco, his last lord, acted as commander of the Venetian forces, indeed, for 9 years. But I'm not showing you Francesca. I'm showing you his very difficult, very determined, very impressive wife, Isabella d'Este, in a drawing by Leonardo that's now in the Louvre. Isabella had a deep interest in the arts, and despite this, she was a very difficult cross for the elderly Mantegna to bear. She was always seeking work for him, but it always had to follow her rules, not his. Something else she was desperate to achieve was a work by his Venetian brother-in-law. And if you read the correspondence which went on for many, many years between the Marchioness and her Venetian agents, you are struck by the difference in lives between Bellini and Mantegna. Bellini was a Venetian citizen. He could essentially do what he wanted, and he was free to choose whether or not to work for the Marchioness, whereas Mantegna in Mantua was bound to do, at least to try to obey, the precepts of his patron. And in the early 16th century, as Mantegna ailed and suffered not just from illness, but from debt, Isabella relentlessly pursued Bellini for a painting which she wanted to be hung next to the work of Mantegna in her private rooms in the ducal palace. And firstly, she said she only wanted a subject of her choosing, but Bellini refused. Firstly, courteously, then repeatedly and increasingly rudely, to make the sort of allegorical painting that the Marchioness loved and in which Mantegna excelled. And as her correspondent, the somewhat desperate by this point Venetian art collector Michele Vianello wrote in June 1501, he was eager not to offend the Marchioness, but he also needed to get his point of view across. But of that narrative your ladyship gave Bellini, he cannot say how unwillingly he would do it, because he knows of your lady's discernment, and also that the picture would be compared with those works by Messer Andrea Mantegna. And thus he wishes to do what he knows best, and he says that in this narrative he cannot do something that will come out well or in which there will be something good. So he refused to do what she wanted. And in 1506, after 10 years of negotiation, Isabella was still waiting for her picture. Bellini certainly held out with admirable firmness, and eventually Isabella, not someone to take no for an answer, was forced to settle for exactly the sort of painting she had disparaged, a picture of the Nativity. And I haven't got one here, but here's the Virgin and Child, and this is the sort of stock painting that Bellini spent his career doing, and this was exactly what Isabella didn't want. She wanted a subject more like this, the Sacred Allegory, or these allegories made by Bellini to be put into furniture in Venice, but he didn't do this type of work often, and he certainly didn't want to do anything that would be compared to the work of Mantegna. Bellini was actually very interested in classical antiquity, but he wasn't interested in the sort of things that really excited Mantegna. Instead, he was interested in how classical authors had thought about what he called tonal painting. That's the careful subtlety and exploitation of tones and glazes in painting. And this was enhanced by his careful study of Pliny's Natural History, a Roman text which was much examined by 15th and 16th century Italian thinkers. And he was also interested in a more poetic idea, that is, I suppose, the poetics of painting, an idea that comes from the ancient world, that painting had a status which was as intellectual and as important as art forms that were written, and in particular poetry. This was a position that Giovanni Bellini developed in paintings such as the Pietà from the Brera, or the Madonna of the Meadow here from London. And it's a very different take on the classical world than that developed by Mantegna, and it's one that Giorgione and Titian, of course, in the next century, were very much to make their own. And I think you can also see an awareness of classical poetry and its often elegiac and pastoral mood in many of Bellini's religious paintings, such as the incredible St. Francis in the Frick collection in New York, or indeed in altarpieces, such as that for San Giovanni Crisostomo, or a very, very rare painting of a biblical historical painting, The Drunkenness of Noah, today in the museum in Besançon in eastern France. But really what I'm showing you is that Bellini and Mantegna's attitude to antiquity was very, very different, as indeed was pretty much everything else in their life and work. But after Mantegna's lingering decline and death, Bellini's position changed. When Mantegna died in 1507, in great debt and in great suffering, one of the works that was found in Mantegna's studio was a canvas inaugurating the cult of the goddess Cybele in Rome in the year 204 before Christ. This painting is today in the National Gallery in London, and it's a subject of utterly stunning obscurity. Never before or since has it been the subject of a painting that I or any other art historian is aware of. So I'll explain it to you briefly. According to the Roman writers, Livy, Ovid, and Appian, and indeed to the Sibylline books of prophecy, consulted by the Roman authorities in the year 204 BC, they had recommended, the Sibylline prophecies had recommended, the introduction of Cybele, the earth goddess, whose cult was based in Asia Minor, therefore in modern Turkey, into the most virtuous man in Rome. And if this were to happen, Rome would be victorious in the Punic Wars against her long-standing enemy, the Carthaginians. Now, how on earth was this going to happen? How could you introduce a goddess from Asia Minor to a man in Rome? And it happens because Cybele, represented here as a spherical stone carried on a litter, apparently she'd fallen from the heavens to earth in the form of a meteor, is taken into the city on Rome. And she's being presented to Publius Scipio Cornelius Nasica. He's the kneeling, long-haired youth in Mantegna's painting, who was deemed, according to Livy, the worthiest man in Rome. And as a result, he was chosen to host the goddess on her arrival before a temple was built for her. Now, this improbable subject was very important to Francesco Cornaro, the Venetian nobleman who had commissioned it from Mantegna, obtaining permission, of course, from the Marquis of Mantua beforehand. And this was because Cornaro's family claimed to be descended from Publius Scipio. And Mantegna's painting was one of 4 canvases that Cornaro envisaged to be placed in a room in his palace on the upper levels of this space as friezes in the Palazzo Corner in Venice. And it's painted in a manner that Mantegna made his own to imitate sculpture in paint, called grisaille. And you'll see that using the basic colors of black and white, Mantegna has really skillfully executed a relief, and it looks like a 3-dimensional carving, but it was done in the 2-dimensional media of paint on canvas. His fictional carving of the arrival of Cybele in Rome is set against a brilliant red-orange stone which mimics cameos, those tiny sculptures made from carving semi-precious stones, which were much admired by collectors of the 15th century. For instance, in Lorenzo de' Medici's inventory of 1492, the most valued objects are his cameos, not his paintings. So in this picture, Mantegna is trying to demonstrate, and I think really succeeding, the superiority on his terms of painting to sculpture. Cybele is a completed and marvelous work, but there is no sign of the 4 other canvases, the 3 other canvases that Mantegna was supposed to work. And this is probably because his death happened in the middle of a dispute with Francesco Cornaro. Mantegna was asking to be paid for more than had been agreed. But after his death, it was only after incredible difficulty, and indeed after lodging a formal complaint in the Mantuan court, that Cornaro was able to prize this work from the grasping hands of Isabella d'Este, who was vying with her brother-in-law, Cardinal Sigismondo Gonzaga, for all the works that were left in Mantegna's studio. So Cornaro got 1 work, but he wanted 4. What was his solution going to be? He turned to Bellini, an artist very well known to his family, and unlike Isabella d'Este, he had some success. And Bellini painted a picture very, very unlike him, and possibly 2 more. This is the one that survives, an episode from the life of Publius Cornelius Scipio, in a sort of posthumous paragone or competition with Mantegna. Bellini's painting is a much more familiar antique subject than that described by Mantegna in Cybele. Scipio's continence was a subject which was known to many Italians. In fact, it was often made for the wedding chests that throughout Italy were commissioned at the time of marriage as a sort of complement to the virtues of the bride and the groom. The story is not as familiar today as it was in the 15th century, so I'll describe it very briefly to you. Scipio, or so the story went, was offered a very, very beautiful Carthaginian girl as his mistress after the Romans had sacked and defeated Carthage in 209 BC, thus bringing to fruition the prophecy that was represented in Mantegna's painting of Cybele. But this girl had been promised in marriage to a virtuous young man from Carthage, and he got his fiancée back as long as he promised Scipio and the Romans to help reconcile the Romans with the Carthaginians. And the story was much loved in Renaissance Italy because it showed that even a military man like Scipio could achieve peace without bearing arms, and that everybody, even the powerful, had to behave virtuously. And I think because the subject was so well known, it wasn't one where Bellini could have feared, even from beyond the grave, of any form of competition with his dead brother-in-law, because this was the sort of run-of-the-mill narrative that Mantegna would never have deigned to take on. We were able to bring the 2 pictures together for the first time at the conclusion of the Mantegna and Bellini exhibition in London and Berlin in 2019, and I'm showing you this juxtaposition here on the screen. When you compare the two paintings, it's evident that Bellini was really concerned that his Scipio, which is the larger painting, and the painting on top, would harmonize and not fight with Mantegna's Cybele. And he worked very hard to make its orange-brown background, which is simulating a stone called rosso antico, work it so that it would work coloristically in tune with Mantegna's painting. Although it's very, very different. Mantegna's painting contrasts the cut stone of the cameo with its background, whereas Bellini's painting is trying to achieve very different sort of levels of artistic depth. Bellini's painting is also very uneven in quality. It's also difficult to see completely because it's not in the world's most fantastic condition, but it's very, very different to the precision and excellence of Mantegna's work, probably, I think, because it was really antithetical for Bellini to paint like this. And the reason he was trying to paint like this is because of wanting to do something which would really honor and work for the legacy of his brother-in-law. I think it's very striking in Bellini's paintings how the living beings, particularly the horses that you might see along the right side of the composition, really seem to jump out of it. It's a painting that, for all its virtues, lacks the order and the harmony of Mantegna's Cybele. So, as these paintings demonstrate, at this point, the art of Bellini and Mantegna was really worlds apart. For all this, it does seem that Bellini undertook this commission in a genre and in a pictorial style that he would never have chosen because of his desire to honor Mantegna's memory and reputation. At this stage in his life, Bellini had absolutely nothing to prove. He was the most admired painter in Venice, he was prosperous, he was well-connected, and he was accustomed to very extravagant praise. But it seems that he felt it was extremely important to make a special effort for his recently deceased brother-in-law. As his contemporary Lorenzo de Pavia tells us, this was partly out of a sense of honor, but also out of respect for Master Andrea Mantegna. And for this, Bellini was prepared to push himself in ways that might seem surprising and which were not always successful. So I think in this example, and in the others that I've talked about, I've demonstrated the long creative stimulus over a period of 50 or 60 years that mutual respect, rather, I think, than competition, brought to the development of the very different but equally brilliant artistic visions of Andrea Mantegna and Giovanni Bellini.